I thought I'd take a few minutes just to talk about what comes first. And that is also a reflection of what we call the number one sun. There are two principles that come first. The number one girl, which is true in the northern hemisphere in the moment, and the number one boy that's in the southern hemisphere in the moment. But I'm going to focus mostly on the number one sun. Now, part of my curiosity about the presence of the number one sun is that it represents that which is soft, in many ways invisible, mostly invisible, and corresponds to the presence of inspiration, creativity, imagination, and it also arrives most of the time unseen. This picture I put up is relatively new. It's from NASA, and it's part of a new map NASA is making of neutrinos. Neutrinos are subatomic particles, so small they mostly pass through everything without touching anything. I've been fascinated with neutrinos for the last 40 years for a variety of reasons I won't go into for the moment. But neutrinos, they arrive like the wake before a boat. So if you think of a supernova explosion happening in deep space, it sends out an immeasurable number of neutrinos. But those neutrinos, they travel just faster than the speed of light. So they arrive before the physicalness of the visible white light arrives. So they're making this wonderful map of the neutrino radiation that now is over a decade or more. They've been compiling the information literally back to the mid-1980s was the first time they started using neutrino detectors. And the first time they ever noticed it was in 1986 when they had their brand new neutrino detectors operating deep within the Earth. And then like a little Geiger counter, they started going off. And they got then the Hubble to be able to point to the direction in space that indicates where it was. And then a few hours later, the white light of a supernova arrived. So that was the first time that they used neutrinos to predict the arrival of white light. To me, that's the same thing about number one sun. And it's the same thing about awareness, innocence, inspiration. What is the thing that comes first? Well, for a long time, for better than 30 years, I operated from the premise that number one sun came first and corresponded to midnight, the beginning of the day. Now I understand that it's not the beginning, because the beginning has to do with the interior experience of feeling, what we call two girl, peace, and her mother, four girl, which also is grace of heart, or the capacity to change or receive, and six girl, which has the ability to be able to consolidate and receive things that are invisible. It's a faith-based principle. So the 2, 4, and 6 girls, they precede the experience of number one sun. The number one sun comes at the solstice. That's the winter solstice. Now we're into the very beginning of the 4th week of the number one boy month in the southern hemisphere. So the number one boy has to do with the arrival of invisible opportunities manifesting as unseen inspiration that also corresponds to one's breath. So breathing is automatic and unseen for the most part, and corresponds to this appreciation of the number one form of awareness. You can call it many things, but for me, the number one form of awareness has to do with an innocence that knows of the existence of the divine and invisibly aspires through some act of intention and or faith to experience and harmonize with the presence of the divine in this moment. There is a consideration for how you do that. You can experiment with many things. Yes, the number one sun also is a series of lessons that you can learn from. Now, it's particularly challenging if you're a woman in the southern hemisphere, because now you have 6 months before the next summer solstice. You pass through month after month in 6 forms of masculinity. So for 6 months, the ascending day length, starting with number one sun, the ascending day length travels 3 months during the winter and 3 months from the equinox to the summer solstice, and you pass through the 6 points of masculinity. Now, the challenge in that is we all have difficulties with masculinity. Doesn't matter whether you're male or female, we all have material, physical, masculine, triggered reactions about, you name it, control, authority, physical body, mind, patriarchy. For 6 months, you and I have the opportunity to experience and deal with increments of how we feel about embodying our own intentional masculinity. The first month, you can call it inspiration if you want. I do. But I also think that the primary way to enter into it is a form of harmlessness. You can call that innocence, because I do. So if there is a tip of everything, if there is a tip that precedes the white light, there is something that arrives before the white light. It is a choice I make. I know that's an odd way of considering it. Can I make an intentional, invisible choice to experience or to receive something that I don't have a sensory presence to identify with my eyesight, my hearing, my smell, my taste, my touch? Can I relate to it? And for me, the answer is yes. And that one of the primary things to enter into it is with an innocence. You can call it a brand of kindness if you want, but that kindness has more to do with the behavioral things with other people, which is important too. But what would be the cleanest, purest state of awareness that I might enter into, and from that point be able to receive and distribute more of that very important quality or attribute? Number one, sun, is also linked to and connected to the second step or the second month of the winter, and that's called the three boy or truth. Innocence is connected to truth. That truth also has an ever-increasing knowing or awareness. So the innocence and the awareness are connected. One can say the awareness precedes the innocence. One could say the background silence precedes the awareness and the innocence, and that's also true. But for those of us practicing to be in the material world with some degree of clarity and intention, innocence and truth are the first two steps. The third step has to do with 5-boy, the position called the throat or the parathyroid, and has to do with the singularity of choice. The singularity of choice has to do with a free will. My existence and my right to make choices within somewhat of a limited spectrum until I make those choices that are greater and greater degrees of harmony. I can make a choice. Boy 1, an innocence. Boy 3, a truth. Boy 5, a relevance or a reliance or the capacity to make a choice. You can call it authenticity, you can call it singularity, but it's me becoming more of what I actually am as I was originally designed, not what anybody else would expect. So the manifestation of that uniqueness that is one soul is the third month of winter. The fourth month in the sequence represents the first month of spring. Where they meet is the equinox. But remember, this is a continuation of 6 months in a row of different forms of masculinity. 3 of them being from the mother's side. That's boys 1, 3, and 5. Maps of this have been given to you at times. Then the second half of that sequence is boys 2, 4, and 6, and they correspond with spring. And then the next 2 months leading up to the summer solstice of 6 men in a row. Why is this important? Well, for me, the recognition of where we are right now as a collective society has to do with how am I going to use my own presence, awareness, or choice. How am I going to use that in harmony with all the 6 masculine parts of me? How am I going to do that in a way that is related to and married to the other half of my existence, which is my family tree from the women in my family? The women in my family start like it is in the northern hemisphere, and that is the 1 girl, the 3 girl, the 5 girl. That's summer in the northern hemisphere, and then goes into the autumn and the equinox of the autumn, peace of the autumn, 2 girl, the change of the autumn, 4 girl, the opening of color in the autumn, which is 6 girl or light, 6 men followed by 6 women, a pulse. So for those of you in the southern hemisphere, you're in the very beginning of taking the accumulation of the last 6 months and bringing it into a chosen opportunity to increase. Go over that again. Those of you in the southern hemisphere, you're at the very beginning of the 1 boy month. Even though it is the going into the last week of that month, this is still just the very beginning of the sequence of 6. So that feeling of the very beginning that takes you through the next 6 months is something really you would intrinsically be sensitive to. Now, if you need some comparison, if you want to stand on your masculine side for a moment and look over to your feminine side and see these 6 women there aligned 1 through 6, you might consider how has it been in your family tree, this relationship between men and women? Well, this relationship between men and women, I don't know where you've been, but for me, that relationship has not been easy in my family tree. And the relationship of men and the relationship of women has been chaotic at best, terribly destructive in many ways to each other in society and so on. So if you're going to stand inside of the very beginning of a march of 6 months in your masculinity, those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, how would you treat women differently? Because what you put in now becomes what you manifest in your relationship when it comes to the summer solstice 6 months from now. I know that's a lot to consider. I'm saying take a moment, take a breath, and consider what you would like to input and act upon, because that's what the masculine principle does. It produces mobilization. With boys 1, 3, and 5, it mobilizes inspiration, idea, discovery, truth, and it manifests into relevance, creativity, imagination, free will, authenticity. It manifests into a movement. Those 3 from the winter go into passion, purpose, to boy, spring equinox. It goes into social dynamics, the multiplier of friendship and the opening of the heart goes into the 6th boy. Whatever you do now is going to gradually keep accelerating for 6 months. So I'm suggesting that you just take a pause and consider what is the cleanest, finest, sweetest feeling that you could ever endow yourself to feel and increase by your own choice. Call it what you want. Call it love. I think love is yet to arrive, but yes, love expressed as innocence, kindness, caring, mercy, inspiration. There's something very precious about, I've shown you these images before, but just to remind you, if it started with a feeling like a child, it could look something like this. So what would the feeling be if it were going to be the primary thing that you inputted right here, and this otherwise lemon molecule? What's the feeling that you want to increase forever? Number 1 sun is the forever sun. Whatever you do with him, yourself, your own number 1 feeling of your presence, of breath, embodied through your soul, consider what that might feel like. I like to remind myself of neutrinos. I'll have another presentation later about why neutrinos, but take a look at that image. To me, the innocence of the pink arrives first. Something for you to consider on the 4th week of the 1st month of winter. Talk to you soon.